Hello, Tungsten Miner here. We are continuing this series on thermal expansion, thermodynamics, and the related mods. Last time we had finished talking about all the various machines and all the various devices, so this time let's get on to dynamos and power generation. You may remember this steam engine from our early example. It burns some kind of fuel, coal in this case, but could be wood or whatever it is you can stick in a furnace, to heat up water, producing steam, which then gets converted into power. The power then goes out the top through some kind of conduit and into whatever you want, in this case just an energy cell. It needs a constant supply of water to keep operating, and it needs a constant supply of fuel. In this case I've just dropped the fuel in there, and when it runs out I'd have to manually go stick some more in there. But you can use ducts and whatnot to be able to send items into the dynamo. So turn this guy on. It's going to fill up its steam chamber using some of the water and slowly start producing power. But in this case, all of the power is able to go over to here, and we see it slowly filling up. If I were to, for example, turn off the conduit on this side, now the power can't get in, and we'll see it's slowly starting to build up its own internal reservoir of power. And when it gets to the top, it's just going to keep on burning fuel to no effect. So that's kind of undesirable. You want to make sure it's hooked up to something where it can use that power. Turn this guy back on, and now it's going to start pulling the power down again as fastly as this conduit can bring it over. It is a machine, so it can accept various kinds of augments. I've got one in here right now, but here are all the different kinds. First is this auxiliary transmission coil, which makes it produce power more quickly, but it burns up the fuel more quickly, and so you get less power overall for each unit of fuel that you put in there. But you get it more quickly. So if you've got some kind of process that's very power hungry and requires a lot of power all at once to keep going, you can use this, and you can use multiples of these in order to get more power more quickly at the cost of requiring more fuel to do it. This guy's basically the opposite. Makes things more efficient, but it produces power more slowly, but it produces more power over time per unit fuel. This guy is kind of a throttle. So if, like I was saying before, this is filled up its internal buffer, this augment will make it so that it slows down the rate of fuel consumption in order to avoid spending fuel uselessly. And I'm pretty sure it actually will turn the machine just about completely off in order to do it. Not all the way off, so it's still worthwhile to make sure that you've got some other mechanism in place. Here we've got a turbine conversion, which makes it so that if you have this in there, you have to provide the steam from the outside. But that means you don't need to provide water, and you don't need to provide solid fuel, just the steam, and then the turbine will do its work, and much more efficiently, produce a lot more power. There's one catch though. There's no machine or device in thermal expansion which produces steam, so you need some other mod which can. So Railcraft can, it's got steam boilers. Industrial Craft can, it's got also a steam boiler. Let's see what else. Big reactors can. Its main reactors will all produce steam. So there's lots of choices where to get steam from, just not from within this mod. However, if you can provide steam, these things are a good choice because they'll produce a lot of power for you much more efficiently. And then finally, there's this transmission coil ducting. And this allows you to insert fuel and water through the top. So there's certain kinds of pipe systems. Ender.io, for example, has piping systems where you can move all sorts of different things, including RF power and fuel and liquids and solids, all through a pipe system that fits within a single block. So maybe you only need one block to land on the top here to take away the power that's produced and to provide the fuel and water that's required. There's also a type of pipe in this mod which allows you to move both items and power. So that would be another way that you could wind up using that augment to just save yourself some piping around the sides of the engine, make things a little bit easier to manage. Like our other devices, you can use redstone control to control the engine. In this case, I've got it set to expect a high signal. So when I flip this switch, the engine goes on. When I turn the switch the other way, the engine goes off. and it loses a bit of steam, and its power quickly gets transferred over to our energy cell over there. But apart from that, it stops consuming all of its consumables until you turn it back on again. So that's one way that you can use a system. You can have something rigged up to detect when one of these guys is full, and then trigger a redstone signal to turn off the engines, for example. Anyway, so that's your steam dynamo. Next is the Magmatic Dynamo, which, as you probably have already guessed, runs off of magma. You pump in magma, it produces power. Very, very straightforward. It uses all of the same standard augments that you could use for the steam engine, but it doesn't have anything special or magical going on for it. It does have, however, a specialization, this isentropic reservoir, which makes the engine both create more power more quickly and use fuel more efficiently, so more power per unit fuel, at the cost that you have to provide some kind of coolant. It turns out that gelid cryothium is obviously fine, that's a very good coolant, but water also works. So if you have a steady supply of water, and I've got a little water tank back there, you can do the same thing here. And so now we're producing a fair bit more power than this ordinarily would have produced without that augment. We just need to make sure to keep providing it water. The nice thing, though, of course, is that you can use these things without water, which, of course, is we're thinking, hey, where can I find a lot of lava, which may not have a lot of water available? Yeah, exactly. Great power source in the nether. There's your Magmatic Dynamo. As far as flexibility goes, there's really nothing to beat the compression dynamo. So this is basically an internal combustion engine like you'd have in a car. You provide it some kind of fuel, you provide it some kind of coolant. Water is fine, gelid cryothium is fine. Lots of different kinds of fuels. We can look at compression engine uses. Different fuels produce different amounts of power. We kind of talked about this when we were looking at the still for refining fuels. So refined fuel is going to be your best fuel. Crude oil and liquefied coal are going to be your worst fuels. Naphtha is kind of in between. Triol is kind of in between. Not quite as good, but renewable. So that has its advantages, obviously. Creosote is a byproduct from doing a lot of different things and really doesn't have any other uses in this mod. Produces very little power. But hey, if you were just trying to get rid of the stuff anyway, that's a pretty good place to stick it, right? Coolant is necessary. The engine will shut itself down if it gets over temperature. So make sure to keep that well provided. But it produces quite a lot of power very rapidly. And fuel is a very efficient power source, right? You can store a lot of it in these tanks and move it around. So if you find yourself wanting to provide power in a lot of different locations, maybe you set yourself up with a fuel production area, and then you can move, resonant tanks with, hundreds of buckets worth of fuel, which of course represents millions upon millions of RF into distant locations and be able to power lots of different projects in your far-flung corners of your Minecraft world. This, of course, has the same general augments that you can put in anything, but it also has this closed-loop cooling augment, which means that coolant isn't consumed when the engine is running. That does not, however, mean coolant is not required. You need to have this tank full of something. But if you have that augment installed, or the specialization installed, sorry, this never gets used up. So you can just drop some water in there and you don't need to have a steady source of coolant in order to keep things running efficiently. The recipe for this guy, however, is not super easy to make. This cryothium dust, as we talked about, is a little bit hard to come by. But actually everything else is not so terrible. So, compression engine. Excellent, excellent choice. One of the few sources of truly renewable power that this mod provides when you're powering it with tree oil. Next up, we have the Reactant Dynamo. This one's a little funny. It takes some kind of solid and some kind of liquid, and there's a whole bunch of different choices, and it combines them in a, say, chemical reaction in order to produce power. What I have in here right now is cryothium dust and blazing pyrethium liquid, which are the two opposing fuel sources that produce the biggest reaction, I guess, or produce the most power. And so this is, I think, one of the most most rapid reactions that you can get. If we were to look at the Reactant Dynamo here, lots of different choices. Destabilizing redstone as a liquid is very common, with some common mob drops. Sugar and energized glowstone, blaze powder and glowstone. But you notice the numbers on these are not super great, and the stuff is kind of hard to come by. So personally, I tend to stick to the other ways of generating power, because this thing consumes a lot of materials and doesn't produce a lot of power for it. But I guess if you happen to have a lot of this stuff, it's a good way to use it. It has, of course, all the same standard augments, plus it has this elemental catalyzer, which means it produces a lot more power and consumes a lot less fuel, but you can only use the elemental recipes. So when we're looking at this, this is not an elemental recipe. Redstone is not elemental. Glowstone is not elemental. Pyrethium is, because it's descended from one of those 4 blaze-like creatures. Cryothium is, because it's descended from one of those blaze-like creatures. This stuff is not. This stuff is not. This stuff is tectonic pyrethium and erythium dust. So basically, you're constrained to mixing and matching the outputs of your blaze-like creatures, pyrethium and Zephyrarian erythium. Yeah, basically the fluid version of all of those powders plus the solid version of all of those powders, but only the pairs that are opposites. So fire and ice and earth and air are the mixing and matchings that are considered elemental mixing and matchings. Not coincidentally, those produce the best power. So in any case, that's what you'd prefer to use for fuel. And that specialization just makes it that much more effective to use them. And here we have the Enervation Dynamo. Basically, this strips the redstone out of whatever item you throw in here and turns it into energy. So redstone blocks, redstone itself, but even items that you've made that have redstone in them, it'll destroy the item and suck out any energy that the redstone had. It will also pull out any charge that might have already been in that item. So if, for example, you give it a flux capacitor that's fully charged up, it's going to take the 4 million RF, convert that back to available RF through the dynamo, and then destroy the item, taking the extra 2000 RF it can get from converting the redstone that was in there in the first place. So, got lots of redstone, turn it into power. And finally, the last of our dynamos is the Numismatic Dynamo. Numismatic refers to coins, and so not surprisingly, here we have some coins. Turn this thing on, and it's going to slowly start destroying the coins and turning them into power somehow. It's a little screwy, but whatever. If you happen to have lots of extra metal, this is basically what you can do to get rid of it, and to actually use it as a source of power. So it might be interesting to do some math on like using a Buildcraft quarry to power this thing and seeing if that works out in your advantage. I strongly suspect it won't, but hey, maybe you've got a good source of power from maybe a crazy Mistcraft world, or maybe a crazy RF Tools dimension, or something like that. So we've been talking a lot about machines and power production, so let's talk about moving power around. What we see here are one set of energy cells on the bottom that have creative upgrades, and one set on the top that have resonant upgrades, and connecting each one to its partner down below are different kinds of flux ducts. Let's just take a look here. These guys each have their own different characteristics, but basically we're looking at ducts that conduct more and more and more power. So leadstone, hardened, reinforced, signalum, resonant, and cryo-stabilized resonant, I think, maybe? Leadstone, hardened. Yep. Okay. And if we hold down Shift, we can look here and see the leadstone, the lowest level, is going to transmit 1,000 RF per tick, 4,000, 9,000, 16,000, 25,000, and infinite. Now, of course, it's not actually infinite. What now is going to be the limitation, without exception, is going to be the transfer rates either on the thing producing the power on the one side or the thing consuming the power on the opposite side. But the duct itself is not going to place any limitation on the amount of power that can get transferred. And of course, as you might imagine, these things get more and more expensive to build as you go up the chain here. So if we take a look at the recipe here, it's just a little bit of redstone, basically 1 per meter of duct that you're creating, plus some lead and some glass. Moving up to hardened, you want to start with the lower level, add some more redstone and invar. Moving up again, you now need to start from building these empty ducts, which are electrum and any kind of hardened glass, and then use your fluid transposer to fill them with destabilized redstone. Now you can upgrade them, so basically it's like upgrading leadstone to hardened. Well, you can take your redstone energy flux duct and convert them into Signalum-coated, or Signalum flux ducts, and so they can transmit a bit more. Resonant flux ducts are yet another upgrade for Signalum, works basically the same way. And then your cryo-stabilized is kind of the same deal, right? You've got your cryo-stabilized flux duct that's empty, so you're just taking your resonant flux duct and adding hardened glass and electrum. And then you toss it into a fluid transposer and take some gelid cryo-ethium and coat your flux duct with that. And then you wind up with the stabilized kind. So that gets you all your power transfer, and just as a little demonstration of how much more rapid the better ones are, I've got something here where I'm going to start transferring power with that switch at the same time from these creative into the resonant energy cells up here. And we can see already on this side, these two guys are starting to fill up. And now this one, and then the next one. So I'll let these go for a little while, and then we'll see what we get. Okay, I think you can get the idea. We're looking at our leadstone here, and it's barely over 1 million RF. We look at our far end, the resonant here, and it's at 35 million RF already. And everything else is kind of in between. And of course, the cryo-stabilized isn't any further along than resonant, because the limitation is the transfer rate of the energy cell. It's 25,000 RF per tick. And if you remember, that's the energy transfer rate of a resonant flux duct. So this shouldn't be any faster because we're limited by the things on either side rather than by the conduit itself. That's exactly what we'd expect. Of course, this duct could be used to power, say, multiple ones of these, transmitting to multiple ones of these across a single one of these. And in that case, this would limit the throughput because it can only move 25,000 per tick, whereas this one would not. You can move as much as you wanted. So it's only when you get beyond a single energy cell on either side that you start needing to use these guys. But there are your various flux ducts to move power around. Okay, so first power, and now fluids. Here we have our various kinds of fluid ducts. We've got regular fluid ducts, we've got opaque fluid ducts, we've got hardened fluid ducts, which can transmit hot fluids, an opaque version of the same. And then here we have, let's take a look. These guys, Super-Laminar fluid duct. Basically, these kind of work the same thing as our cryo-stabilized flux duct, in that they will transfer as much fluid as can be transmitted from the things on either side. In this particular case, of course, we're moving from one tank to another tank, and over here we're moving from one tank to another tank using these hardened ducts. So, well, the limiting factor is the tank, not the duct. So if we had many more tanks or whatever, we could move them across the single strand, and that's where these guys would start to come in handy, just like the cryo-stabilized flux duct. So if I grab myself a crescent wrench here, crescent hammer, excuse me. And I turn this on, you can see, yep, there it goes, starting to flow down. Do the same thing here, and you can see the tank filling up, but you don't see the fluid moving. If you're on a server that's having issues, this might be a better choice for you, a little less animation. Here we're moving hot stuff, and then finally moving through our Super-Laminar flux ducts. And yeah, as I said before, the limiting factor here is not the conduit, it's the tanks on either side. So not too surprising that everything moves at the same rate between these guys. It's only when you have lots of tanks that you start wanting to want these guys. And here we have item ducts. These are the way to move items. So power, fluid, items, just like you might expect. Here I've got an item allocator that is waiting for redstone signal. If I turn that off, it's going to start dropping items into the duct, and off they go through to the other side. Here's your opaque version of the same thing, and I can go and turn this guy off, and down they'll come, even though we can't quite see them. We will eventually start seeing them turn up. Over here we have a, I keep forgetting the names of things, impulse item duct. Which is really just a version of this that makes things go faster. So if I turn this off, we'll see the individual items go shooting across at a much higher rate. And then here's the opaque version of the same thing. Now you'll notice I'm not pushing them out of this guy any faster, so it's really only the only thing that's faster between your impulse item duct and your regular item duct is the rate at which they traverse the ducting. And since I've only got 2 meters of ducting, it doesn't make a lot of difference in the overall throughput. But if you're sending things a long ways, it will definitely start to make a difference. The recipes here, all pretty straightforward. You take some tin and some hardened glass of whatever kind, and you get these transparent item ducts. To get the opaque ones, you use lead instead. So it's actually easier to make opaque item ducts earlier on in the game, because in order to make that hardened glass, you might recall that you need your induction smelter. So you're going to have a little bit more to build and get ready for if you want to start off with these guys. So those are your item ducts. So next up, let's take a moment and revisit both our fluid and item ducts, because they have another version, which is basically a Signalum-Plated version of each different one, which allows you to move power, RF energy, at the same time as you move items or fluids. So if we look for Signalum whatever, we can see there's our regular Signalum flux ducts, there's the building parts. So here's a opaque fluid duct, and the recipe is to take your regular opaque fluid duct, add some Signalum nuggets and some electrum to just get one of them, or you can do a bunch at a time and just use these guys. The recipe works out about the same. And now you get guys that can transmit 4,000 RF per tick in addition to whatever they normally would transfer. You don't have ordinary fluid ducts, but you basically have all of the rest of the different kinds of ducts. This is particularly handy if you're doing something with, say, like magmatic dynamos, and you need to keep them fueled up, and you need to take the power away. You could use one of these hardened Signalum-coated fluid ducts in order to both pump in the magma and draw out the power. In order to do that, of course, you remember you needed a special augment to be able to inject items through the coil. But once you've got that, now you can do everything all on one side and save yourself some space in your setup. And that will be it for this video. We have covered a lot of stuff. All of those different dynamos, so steam, magmatic, compression, reactant, aeration, numismatic, lots of different fuel sources, but they all produce RF power. Then we talked about flux ducts for moving that power around, fluid ducts for moving fluids, often necessary to power those dynamos. Item ducts, again, sometimes useful for powering dynamos, but very useful for sorting and moving stuff all over the place. And then finally, Signalum-Plated ducts of various kinds, so that you can move both power and stuff, fluids, or items at the same time. Next time, I think we will finish off this series by talking about some interesting looking viaducts over there, and then some of the more detailed mechanics for using these various ducts with attachments and devices that go on them. So if you like this video, go ahead and hit like. If you want to know when that next video is coming out, hit subscribe, and I will talk to you later.